Welcome back to our panel discussion, Zero Trust in the Era of Endpoints, sponsored by Tanium here on Federal News Network. Our guests today are Matthew Marsden. He's Vice President and Technical Account Management Team Leader for Federal at Tanium. Vijay D'Souza is the Director of Information Technology and Cybersecurity for the GAO. Don Watson, Chief Information Security Officer for the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. Gerald Caron is the Chief Information Officer and Assistant Inspector General for IT at the Office of Inspector General at Health and Human Services. And we've got Nick Ward, the Chief Information Security Officer at the Department of Justice. And I'm going to move to you, Jerry, at the HHS OIG. Before the break, we were discussing specific ways of securing your end devices. You have to have visibility into them. You have to make sure they are secure and don't become the open-ended kind of injection points for all kinds of malware. And there has to be a decent user experience to go along with that too. It's sometimes kid about the users wanting BYOD, but they're the ones that have to be productive. So what's your strategy there?
So Nick covered it, and I think I mentioned it in my initial questions. I am looking at, direct connectivity or path towards the cloud that they're trying to access, or the internet, instead of having to come back and VPN to an on-prem just to go back out. There are great solutions out there that are emerging in order to allow for that and still get the telemetry that you need, just like you would through your perimeter stack if you have an on-prem firewall and things like that, and devices that come into your perimeter. So there are things that are very much closer to the edge, and that I think will also increase the user performance at the same time, because you're not doing that VPNing, hairpinning, turning, or boomeranging, as I like to refer to it. Definitely. So Nick also said it, and I mentioned again, things that I can put on a laptop and a desktop aren't the same things that I can put on a mobile device. I can't put the 20 agents that I've seen at some places go on a mobile device, and for every little niche thing that you want to be able to monitor. So it's a little different. But one of the things is one of the things we do is we have a storefront where we whitelist what is allowed on a managed device. So we're controlling what can go on that device. Essentially update the iOS or the OSs on the devices centrally as well, manage that. So, so there's a governance process around it in order to manage them, definitely. And a zero trust, of course, you're all about protecting the data. We talked about BYOD, which is something that I am exploring, but then you're doing application management. Whereas the concept is, once you register that app, the agency is now managing that application and all the policies to that application. Like, I might not let it download a print. Now, do you lose some telemetry of, fully like you would with a fully managed device? Yes, but there are some things you can do. Like in the federal government, there are certain manufacturers we do not want accessing our data whatsoever. So you can see that, you can see what version of OS that they have, and you can allow for blocking of such devices based off the model, or if they're not updated with their iOS until the user updates it and lets them back on. So there are some things that you can do with BYOD. So I wanted to mention that, not that I'm doing that yet, but so those are some of the things that we're doing with fully managed devices right now.
And when you have a zero trust architecture in place, zero trust implies something is happening that is challenging traffic, so that each application or each device call, database call is vetted in some manner. Is this then becoming on mobile devices, since you can't have all these agents necessarily running? Does that make it that every time you send an email, you got to relog on at some extreme, or can this happen to some degree to preserve that user experience, and yet there is zero trust on your network?
So there's a number of factors, and I don't think you can just look at it. When you talk about zero trust, you got to look at a number of factors. It's not just the device in itself. But one of the concepts I have is to do dynamic risk scoring, I'll call it. If you read 800-207, they call it the policy engine in that document. And what it is the device and how that device is being managed. If it's a BYO, if it's a fully managed desktop that has all those great security agents, that has probably a lower risk than a BYOD device, which I'm not fully managing and I can do certain things, or a fully managed mobile device, which I don't have, might still have a little higher risk score possibly than a fully managed desktop with all the great telemetry that you can put on it. So, that's a factor that I take into an overall risk. And then there's how did the user, then I can get into how did the user authenticate? Did they use username and password, which is more risk than using a YubiKey or using a cat card, for example. So all those factors come into what this risk tolerance is overall and what you will allow that user to do or what level of data is kind of the concept. So the end device is one factor that you weigh depending on your risk tolerance. Because I think if you talk to Nick and Don, we all have different risk tolerances for different things based on the levels of data that we have. So you have to have that methodology built in, I think, as a part of your zero trust. It's not just about the technology. You really have to have a risk tolerance and understand what your risk tolerance is, which we very much learned during this past year, what our real risk tolerances were with things when we did mass telework.
Yeah, I think the key to what you said there is you do your activities technically according to a reference policy that governs risk management. And then you've got kind of an orderly approach to it as opposed to constantly scrambling. Don, let's go to USPTO then. Sure. Because the traditional user device has been that PC, that laptop, but now everything goes.
Yes, thanks, Tom. And yeah, our traditional device for our examiners, because of the type of work that they do and the applications that they access to perform their work, is pretty high end. They need the right memory and processing speed and the specifications to support their workload. So we have done a small BYOD pilot when it comes to mobile devices. It's really just for email access right now. But really, our examiners are dependent upon those endpoints. We are looking at a couple of things. We are on a journey to multi-cloud journey. And so with we're looking at virtual desktop infrastructure solutions and how those possibly could serve us within the USPTO, being able to easily deploy virtual desktops and access to applications while securing data. So looking at that. But I think, for our endpoint protection in regards to our laptops and what our examiners have, we have, the typical antivirus and malware protection and data protection with full drive encryption. We've also recently deployed endpoint detection and response, which really ensures we're looking for any malicious and suspicious activity on our endpoints. And also we have LoJack, which is a great thing to have to ensure we can locate our endpoints wherever they are and lock or delete the data before it falls into the wrong hands. We also tracked, we have a service called GeoIP address resolution. It's a database we have, so we're able to track our travelers. And if one of our devices shows up overseas, we're able to get alerted on that quite quickly. Once it gets plugged in, our access is attempted. So we have a lot of good capabilities. And we're also looking at improving data integrity through blockchain technologies. And so really the user experience is giving that memory and processing speed the examiners need, looking at going virtual, and also making sure the security and the data integrity is there.
And VJ, do you get the sense in looking at agencies that that idea of policy then driving the technical responses is the model that they have, that is, as opposed to the sudden scramble we had a year ago last March? Now it's time to get,
well, I think that should be the idea. I mean, I think unfortunately lots of folks are still scrambling. I think folks who work in IT are always trying to play catch up to the new crisis or new event. But yeah, obviously your policy, you should identify your risks and then have a policy that supports the different risk tolerances you have and implement them. I think the other thing that's a real challenge that we're hearing now is, I mean, if you think about the number of different devices and different models and different accesses, pulling all of the security information together in one place where it can really be looked at in a consistent way so that an agency can monitor stuff correctly, it's just becomes increasingly challenging. So I think that's a thing that as we move to all these different access models and different devices coming into the network, that's a thing that I think is going to get more challenging, not less so.
All right. Well, let me ask you, Matthew, when you compare with, say, what industry is doing, it might be useful to ask how some of the large organizations in the commercial sector are handling this. What are their best practices for mobile devices associated with users? And maybe also address the fact that the average user, whether federal or private sector, may have more than one device and probably does.
I think it's almost an absolute at this point. And the good news about what's happening today in industry and government is that there are a lot of common challenges between what's happening in the commercial world and what's happening in the federal and state and local governments. Moving to a distributed workforce has similar challenges across the board. As agencies or organizations implement zero trust architectures and they go along the journey of selecting identity and access management providers and define policies for the devices, and I think Nick and Jerry both did a great job of highlighting the variability of the devices that are going to be connecting to the network. Anything from individual BYOD phones to corporate or government-owned devices that have been shipped out to the user, and a wide variety of devices in between. So being able to make static policies about those devices really is a challenge these days. So you have to have dynamic query ability so that you can get real-time data about the state of the endpoint. Not only do we need to know about the hardware involved, but we need to know the user and we need to know the data that's on that device. So being able to make those types of real-time decisions as to how you're going to allow management access and how you're going to allow access to resources is really critical. So the legacy days, and I think Vijay did a great job of highlighting this as well, the legacy days of statically implementing data collection, pulling it all into a single location and doing post-processing on it, that's becoming less and less effective in today's dynamic world. So that's why we're seeing agencies move more toward real-time, on-demand, ad hoc queries for that type of information to make informed decisions.
In other words, yeah, just to relate to what Don said earlier, say as one of the factors in going into dynamic evaluation would be geolocation. And so a device could be all normal and it looks like the right thumbprint or the right factor, but it happens to be in North Korea. So chances are maybe, that your policy would say, let's take a closer look at that one. Is that the kind of thing you mean?
Absolutely. And also being able to make decisions when you get an indicator like that as to what's the quality or the value of the data that's contained on that device. Being able to know exactly what the risk is of that potential vulnerability or the threat that is present. That may not be a very high risk situation if it's low value data. Conversely, it could be an extremely high risk situation, and being able to make that determination and respond immediately is critical.
Right. And it gets fine grained too, I suppose, because say you are doing a chat back and forth via an application like Slack. That could be something that would not be all that valuable if it were to be intercepted in some way. But now you can use those types of applications to attach documents and attach files. And suddenly then that traffic becomes more critical. Comments on that, Nick?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we can understate the way that we evaluate security of collaboration platforms. And I think if you asked a lot of non-cyber people maybe a year or two ago if email was a critical, high-risk type of solution, they, a lot of them would say, no, it's just email. It's just me chatting with everybody else. And then you realize, wait, I'm sending court documents or I'm sending warrants or whatever, right? Like the types of conversations we have in these platforms are almost to the same level as sitting in a room together with a private conversation. And so it's harder because it's harder than a system with very structured data because what's there. And these collaboration solutions, you don't even necessarily know what's there because it's free form communication and it's unpredictable. So they warrant a lot more security than probably a lot of people thought prior to even like a major breach like we had with the SolarWinds incident this past year.
Don, that would be a big issue for USPTO because people are handling other people's intellectual property, which is a real financial economic value proposition.
Yeah, absolutely. We don't store any of that data on our individual endpoints. We keep all of that secure within our data centers, and we haven't moved any intellectual property into the cloud at this point. We have very, very big concerns on securing that data. And to Nick's point too, we're very, we're very in tune to ensuring that we use cloud services that are FedRAMPed, right? And ensuring we have the right cloud security in place because we have responsible controls as a customer for that cloud service to ensure we have the right, access control, multi-factor authentication, the audit logging, and everything else that we need to have in place. Boundary protection, those things are critical as we do things with the cloud, and using products to collaborate. And if they're cloud-based, very important. We know there's been a I won't mention the vendor, but there's been a particular collaboration platform that has had some concerns in regards to privacy and so on, and I think they just settled in court. But we're very cognizant of what are we sharing. If we're sharing something over collaboration platform, is that conversation and is the information we're sharing and discussing, is it secure, right? Is it something you want to show up in the Washington Post the next day, or is it something that could potentially leak out to the public? That's the kind of approach we take.
All right. We have a lot more to discuss, but on that note, we're going to take a short break. My guests today are Don Watson, the Chief Information Security Officer for the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, BJ D'Souza, Director of Information Technology and Cybersecurity for the Government Accountability Office. Matthew Marsden is the Vice President and Technical Account Manager for Federal at Tanium. Nick Ward, the Chief Information Security Officer at the Department of Justice, and Jerry Caron III, Chief Information Officer and Assistant Inspector General for IT at the Office of Inspector General at Health and Human Services. I'm Tom Temin. This panel discussion is Zero Trust in the Era of Endpoints, sponsored by Tanium here on Federal News Network.